Hey everyone, welcome back to the Ktor Server Fundamentals playlist. In the last video, we covered serving contents in Ktor. In this video, we will dive into the basic authentication in Ktor. So let's start by understanding what basic authentication is. It's a simple authentication method where for every protected route, the client must send both username and password in the request. The credentials are encoded in base64 format. However, base64 encoding is not encryption. It's just a way to represent the credentials in a specific format. So, to prevent credentials from being exposed, basic authentication should always be used over HTTPS. Next, we will install the basic authentication plugin in Ktor. Then, we will configure the basic authentication provider. We will also see how to protect specific routes using this authentication. And finally, we will learn how to validate credentials using built-in user hash table auth provider. Now, let's begin by installing the authentication plugin. So, for that, we can move to version catalog file within this Gradle. Over here, we can simply duplicate this last line and we can say Ktor server auth. Ktor server auth. Now we can move to build Gradle file. Over here as well we can duplicate this last line and we can simply replace this file Ktor server auth. Now let's sync the project. Now to install this authentication plugin, let's move to plugins package. Over here let's create a new file, basic authentication. It will be of type file. Now over here we can simply create a extension function configure basic authentication. Within this we can call install function with our plugin authentication. Now for basic authentication we have this basic, we can make use of this, and also we can give the name to this authentication with, let's say, basic auth. Now to perform the validation we can use this validate. Over here we get access to the credentials. Now we can get both username using credentials.name and password using credentials.password. After validation, we'll need to return user ID principal if authentication succeeds. Else we can return null, that indicates the authentication is failed. So let's suppose for now if username is equal to admin and password equals to password, then we'll mark it as authenticated. So for that we can simply return user ID principal, and in data we can simply say username. We can simply provide the username for the user who has been authenticated. Else we can simply say null. So if we return null, then this simply means validation failed and it will make sure to return 401. Now we can simply call this function within this application. So application module function. Now let's create a route. Let's say we have a GET request. We can simply return text and we can simply say hello world. Now let's first run without any authentication. So if we run our application and make request, everything looks good. We are able to get the response. Now if we want user to be able to access this route only when authenticated, then to make this route protected, we can use authenticate, and within this we can move our every request. Now every request within this route builder, within this authenticate, will be only accessible if user provides the auth credentials and they are authenticated. Along with authenticate, we can also specify basic auth. This is used over here, so you need to use the same ones. So now if we run our application, you can notice the error. We get this error. missing application plugin extension. Authentication holder is not installed. To resolve this, we need to make sure that this basic authentication plugin is above the configure routing. We need to install authentication plugin before installing the routing. Now if we rerun our application, and if we hit the request, we get 401. Since we won't be able to access this route without providing the auth credentials. So for now, our username and password is admin and password. In authorization, we can choose this basic auth. Over here, we can pass both. Our username is admin and password is password, and we get success. But if our username or password doesn't matches, then we get 401. So currently we hard coded the username and password value. There is one more way to store username and password in the memory using UserHashTableAuth. So for that, let's create a function. Let's say create hashed user table. We can simply return user hash table auth. Over here as well, we can say return user hash table auth. Now it requires digester as well as a table. For table, we can simply store as a map. So let's say we want to keep this credential. Let's say for admin to password, and let's say we want to add one more user. Let's say user 2, and let's say password is 123. Now we also need to have a digester. So a digest function is something that encrypts our password. So instead of storing password in plain text format, what digest function will do, it will encrypt our password so that even if someone accesses our database, they won't be able to decrypt our password easily. So we can say digest function, get digest function, and within this we can mention our algorithm. Let's say SHA 256, and we also need to pass the salt. The salts make it quite harder to decrypt our password. We'll discuss this more in our JWT video. So for now, let's give it salt of, let's say, Ktor, and we can simply add the length of password. So for now, let's keep this as a salt. It is a good idea to have different salts for all the users. So for now we have same, but it will still vary based on the length of password. Over here we can simply say digest functions. Instead of plain password, we need to use digest function and pass our plain password. Over here as well, we can say digest function and pass our password. We can simply create our hash table. We can simply say val hash user table equals create hashed user table. Now using this user hash table, we can simply first comment this out, and we can simply say hashed user table dot authenticate and simply provide our credential. This authenticate function will automatically perform the validation. Like if add username and password are valid, then it will return this user ID principal. If authentication is successful, else it will return null. So null will indicate 401 in the response. So now if we run this application, we get 401, but for admin we will get success. We can also use this credential user n123. Let's try out with this as well, user 123, and you see we get successful response. Over here, instead of using this in-memory database, you can also use any form of NoSQL or SQL database like Postgres or any other SQL database or NoSQL database like MongoDB in order to perform this validation. So we can simply store our this username as well as hashed password in our database, and over here we can perform our validation. So that should be it for basic authentication. In the next video, we will be diving into digest authentication in Ktor. So until then, thanks for watching and happy coding.